More than 200 years ago, Americans fought a revolution against big government.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and has sent hither swarms of officials to harass our people and eat out their substance.
George III and his bureaucrats taxed and controlled their lives until the people said, enough. The government in Washington, D.C. makes you nostalgic for old King George. The royal tax collectors took about 25% from our ancestors. This year, government at all levels will extract 50% of our money to waste. And not gently. IRS agents use wiretaps, mail openings, informants, disguises, guns, chains, and jails to get every last dime. Meanwhile, at the Federal Reserve, 12 faceless bureaucrats decide your economic future in secret. How much the Federal Reserve, 12 faceless bureaucrats decide your economic future in secret. How much inflation should there be next year? What should interest rates be? How much of your savings should be transferred to politicians and their favored big banks? The Supreme Court, where individual rights are supposed to be protected, think it's fine if government invades our financial privacy, spies on us in our bedrooms, regulates church schools, and restricts our free speech. Meanwhile, at the Congress, everything is up for grabs. Everything is up for grabs, as long as it's yours.
People, this is the gravesite of a state senator in Georgia who was murdered, brutally murdered, while she slept, allegedly. You can see her husband was also murdered. Got his little nameplate. This was about a month ago. This is the 1-year anniversary of Bruce and Nancy Schaefer's murder. And a permanent tombstone has not yet been erected. And it looks like someone came and kicked Nancy Schaefer's little cross and messed up the name on it. Nancy was a political hot potato. Behind me, this pad behind me, marks the final resting place of a man named Bruce Schaefer, who dearly loved his wife, Nancy Schaefer. And they want us to believe he shot her one time in the back while sleeping in bed and then shot himself. They had just financed the movie documentary about all these children being wrongfully scammed by CPS. But it seems ironic, if not tragic in the classical Greek sense of the word, that here we are, 11 months after Nancy and Bruce were murdered. There's no permanent headstone here yet. Concrete looks like it's only been poured in the last 4 or 5 months. And it's February 24th, 2011. And William Fain, who refused to tell me who financed his documentary that he is this coming weekend selling, as he told me, to some people from Hollywood, he refused to tell me who financed this documentary. Well, bear with me. We've got some cowboys at the end of this show to lift your endomorphins. But first I want to talk to you about the murder. Most of us remember when Congressman Kennedy died in a freak skiing accident. He was a Democrat. Wasn't very long after that, a Republican named Sonny Bono died in a freak skiing accident. Sort of like even the score between the two major parties. Most of us don't know, and there hasn't been a good documentary on the murder, I say murder, of U.S. Senator Wellstone, which is why I often say to people, don't have a Wellstonian accident. He was flying with his wife on a way to a funeral of a friend, and his plane crashed in clear blue skies in Minnesota. But the media spin was that he died in a terrible storm and there was icing on the wings and things were really bad and he shouldn't have been flying in that bad weather. It wasn't true. The media lied. Most of you know my show. We've showed you the third building that came down on 9/11, 7 World Trade Center, in free fall speed, and there's no mention of it in the mainstream media. If you've watched my show very long, you know who General Benton Parton is.
I spent 25 years in research and development. Most of that was in the weapons area. I had graduate training in armament engineering.
You can go to my YouTube channel and see a new clip of General Benton Parton explaining why Timothy McVeigh could not possibly have blown down the Alpha P Murrah building in Oklahoma. It didn't happen that way. Because the blast on the pillars was not from this truck bomb on the outside blowing in. The pitting was on the inside of the pillars facing the building of things blowing out. It was done with demolition charges and killed dozens and dozens of children at a daycare center and about 160 people. And we've been lied to continually by our government. In the midst of all this lying by the media, you remember the national media. You remember what's her name, Valdez on Nancy Disgrace, or those other people on Fox and CNN, all telling, oh, it looks bad for Michael Jackson, looks bad for Michael Jackson. And I was saying, it doesn't look that bad for Michael. He's winning most days. Show me one honest witness. And I predicted he would be found not guilty by the jury. Because although it was an all-white jury with a few Hispanics, they were decent citizens, elderly citizens, and they looked at the crappy evidence and said, he's not guilty. So in the midst of all this, you should not be surprised if the government of Georgia, particularly the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, has come to a conclusion based on evidence that doesn't add up that way, that Bruce Schaefer shot his own wife in the back, one shot, then turned the gun on himself like this, which is kind of awkward to do, with an unlicensed gun that wasn't registered to anybody when he had a registered gun in his house available to him. There's a lot of things that do not add up in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. For that reason, I went to Georgia, and you just saw the opening scene at the gravesite with still no headstones. In fact, the family didn't even want to tell me. They wouldn't return my call to tell me where Nancy and Bruce were buried. At Tulilla Falls, up above the falls, one of Senator Nancy's favorite places. In fact, Nancy Jr. and Ed Jr. Schaefer were afraid to talk to me. Something's not right with this investigation, and I'm going to give you now a gal who did a radio show about corruption in South Carolina who called me while I was in Georgia and told me what she knew about Nancy and the fact that Nancy used throw away phones because she knew her own phone wasn't safe anymore. Something I let out 7, 8 months ago. But Wilkie, that was doing the video documentary, absolutely says that's not true. She didn't use any other cell phones but the ones he knew about. Not true. We'll go to this tape, and we're going to get into this because it's important that we, the people, know why Nancy was murdered. And I'll give you a hint. She was trying to push through legislation when she was a state senator through the Georgia legislature, which Senator Thomas was fighting tooth and nail to water it down and just water it down so it didn't mean anything, so it had no teeth. This legislation had to do with making child protective services accountable, holding pedophiles who hold public office accountable, holding foster parents accountable, things that every decent, right-thinking person would want. And yet she got stiff opposition within her own Republican Party. She was a devout Christian. I spoke to people at her church. Most of them didn't want to go on camera. Some of them didn't even want to say anything. And then I get this call from the radio talk show host. And I think you'll find it very interesting. Because I find it difficult, but I'll let you decide. I find it difficult to believe State Senator Nancy Schaefer, on the eve of coming out with a book that was going to name pedophiles, homosexuals that use their office and political office to do things to children they shouldn't be allowed to do, CPS workers that are corrupt, judges that are corrupt, on the eve of coming out with a book with Mr. Wilkie there, Wilkie Fain, coming out with a television documentary to back up the book for the 1-2 punch to knock corruption. Suddenly, her husband decides to kill his wife and then shoot himself in the chest. That apparently is what the Georgia Bureau of Investigation wants us to believe. I've got a copy of the report. I have it right here. But let's go hear what this talk show person who does a radio show said when she called me. You'll only see my face because it was a phone interview. Jane?
She was afraid.
Jane?
Yes.
This is William Wagener. Do I have your permission to tape this conversation we're having?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
And your name is?
Jane Boyer.
And would you spell your last name, Jane?
B-O-Y-E-R.
And you do a radio show in South Carolina?
Yes, Abuse Freedom Life.
And if I understood what you said, you talked to, say this again, you talked to...
I spoke with Nancy Schaefer the day before she was killed or shot.
And she said what to you? She was...
Well, we spoke about several issues. One of them was she suggested I get a throwaway phone. And because she said she had started using them. And I asked her, TK had asked me to see if she would go to Washington last year. And I'd asked her, and she said, no, that she was afraid to go. And I said, well, I'm sure you would be protected. She said, well, she would talk to her husband about it and see if he wanted to go with her. And maybe, but she didn't know. She said she had to be really careful. Her book was ready to be published. She had a date with, she had just been to Atlanta to speak to the publisher, and someone else, I've been trying to remember who it was, before it could be done, there was, some tweaking, and then the publisher would take it